There is a one-page handout that I have a few more copies of. If anyone didn't receive this on their way in, I can share a few more with the choir. Yep. And if there's anyone else that needs a copy, I'm going to just leave them on the chair. Yeah. Oh, that'd be wonderful. Thanks. So a few months back, my wife Linda and I were watching the news hour on TV, and like each of you, we go through that roller coaster ride of distress, of sadness, of grief, occasionally hope, occasionally wonder that our interconnected world provides us with information about daily, hourly, even every second. And on that night in particular, we became engrossed in a story about reproductive justice centered on the state of Missouri. The story was about how some of Missouri's neighboring states, like Illinois and Kansas, that had not criminalized reproductive health care, were providing support for people who crossed the state border out of Missouri with health care needs, seeking medical assistance. And we were inspired by the organizations that had ramped up their staffing and ramped up their facilities to meet the need that people who lived out of state and were coming with them into Illinois and Kansas, for example, and equally distressed by the misogyny that undergirds so much of the opposition to reproductive justice. The story then turned to focus on the advocacy work of reproductive justice activists in Missouri and some of the neighboring states. And the video began to show a rally and a march taking place. Well, like most of you, beyond absorbing the message and the ministry of the moment in those images, Linda, my wife, and I had the same response. We began looking for the love people, for the yellow shirts. Maybe some of you know what I mean. If you don't, a little background. In 2007, 2008, I was a brand new employee at the Unitarian Universalist Association after about a dozen years of serving as a parish minister. The staff group that I joined was called Advocacy and Witness, and most of its amazing staff were working out of what was then known as the UUA Washington, D.C. office. Our leader, my supervisor, was Reverend Meg Riley, an incredible leader in our movement throughout her life, a born and raised UU from West Virginia, who brought her powerful voice for Unitarian Universalism and justice everywhere, from the halls of Congress to CNN during many difficult days. Reverend Meg, you may know, went on to become the senior minister of our largest congregation, the UU Church of the Larger Fellowship, leading it during what many would call its heyday. And today, after retiring from that ministry, she serves as the elected co-moderator of the Unitarian Universalist Association itself. Meg has seen it all, mentored so many, led the way in so much, and shown up with powerful ministry over and over again. She would tend to credit others with the yellow shirts movement, though I credit her with so much of it, and here's why. In the summer of 2008, a year after I joined the UUA staff, a tragedy struck one of our churches in Knoxville, Tennessee. You may remember, 200 church members were gathered there for a performance of a musical, Annie Jr., by 25 children and youth on a special summer Sunday morning, when Jim David Atkinson walked in and opened fire on the audience with a sawed-off shotgun. Several people were injured, 2 were killed, before 4 church members restrained him, and the broad effects of the trauma from that morning simply can't be overstated. In the weeks, the months, and the years that followed, the church in Knoxville and the UUA support response was grounded in our deepest values. Spiritual and emotional care were provided to the people. Interfaith connections in the city brought immense support to the community. And as a movement, we took out a full-page ad in the New York Times, you may remember, that declared, "Our doors and our hearts will remain open." Beloved people who were lost and heroes who emerged were memorialized and honored. Grief, horror, and trauma were faced, and it is remarkable to me that that church remains a powerful force for good to this very day. And around the country, Unitarian Universalists sought a path through and beyond the traumatic events of that day as well. And one way that was found was led by Reverend Meg and Adam Gerhard Stein, along with many other wise colleagues. That way, as some of you know, became known as standing on the side of love, or as we affectionately called it in the early days, pronouncing SSL as Sizzle. I was not a part of Sizzle's development, but I had the good fortune of watching some stages of its development from close in on the sidelines and being a staff group colleague of those who were puzzling out loud about the creation of it. It was truly amazing to behold. I have so much appreciation and respect for how they sought to build something new, something that didn't exist, but which our churches needed, especially as follow-up to the tragedy in Knoxville, and how what was created brought something new to life that was also old and deep, a treasure within our movement. Reflecting on how they managed to do that, I've thought of what some religious people call the via negativa. The via negativa is a pathway to understanding truth. It's the path that examines and sees and focuses in on deep truth by removing first distractions, and then nice ideas, and then ideas that come close to but aren't quite the deepest truth, and slowly following the via negativa continues to remove ideas that are precious, so precious that they may reflect the deepest truth, but since they aren't that truth itself, perhaps they are only the moonlit finger pointing at the moon, but not the moon itself. They too must be passed over. The via negativa is hard in that way. It asks us to stop focusing on some beautiful things when we realize that they are transient as we search for the permanent. Now, if I follow the via negativa in Unitarian Universalism to try to identify our center, at some point I end up with a duality. After shedding much that I value and love about our characteristics as a faith and tradition, I end up with two profound religious ideas: heart and mind. Compassion or empathy and reason. And once there, I get a little stuck. If I must release one to follow the via negativa to its conclusion, which will it be? Well, with all that we've shared this morning in mind and much more, I take a different path. I release them both. And I choose what they are pointing to. Empathy and reason together. Heart and mind together. I know, you know, and the developers of our profound public ministry know what I've just spoken about. They are pointing to love. What made Sizzle brilliant was its focus on power, on the power of love with a capital L. And in those days, beyond the recovery from the Knoxville tragedy, the power of love was leading us along a number of faithful paths. LGBTQ plus justice. In those days, this was especially focused on marriage equality, on racial justice, on environmental justice, and on immigration justice. Love lit the way for us on these issues. It became a brand and a venue allowing our tiny demographic to move beyond its weight on the public square, and it does still today. It didn't take long to know that Sizzle was onto something when images and videos of public witnesses around the country on issue after issue had a readily identifiable mass of yellow-shirted people in their midst. That yellow was a rare brand choice at the time. It was Sizzle's brand choice, and no one else was using it. So before you knew it, even the media was referring to us that way, those yellow shirts, and eventually, you know what they started to say? They started to say, those love people. In preparation for this morning's service, there was an email that went out to the congregation that showed an image of the Article 2 proposal that I think many of you have already seen. It looks like a flower. And there are 6 petals around the flower, and in the middle of the flower, the center of the flower is the word love. I remember seeing that image for the first time, perhaps in September of 2022. Perhaps you remember the first time that you saw that image, and I remember being drawn to it. And there was a paragraph beneath the image that resonated with me. Perhaps it did with you as well. It said, "Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. Inseparable from one another, these shared values, and these are the petals of the flower, are interdependence, pluralism, justice, transformation, generosity, and equity." Those words are on the proposal sheet that you have with you this morning. I find this idea appealing because it matches my sense of the values that are at the center of our faith tradition, and because it links our values to what it describes as a spiritual discipline, love. But this isn't the weak tea that often gets called love. It's not frilly, it's not silly, it's not puppy love, and it's not infatuation. It's not merely a very strong kind of liking something. No, it's the very power which religions world over timelessly have tried to express. It's the golden and the platinum rule. It's what Unitarians and Universalists have historically centered from John's Gospel, which said, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another." And it's the revolutionary love that Sikh American justice activist and author Valerie Kaur described in this morning's reading. And I like, and I support, how it's clear that this love is expressed through shared values. The shared values identified in the petals of the flower and written on the sheet that you have are both reflective and reminiscent of the 7 principles that have accompanied Unitarian Universalists since 1985, those principles that we looked at earlier in the hymnal. They are reflective and reminiscent of those principles. The Article 2 proposal includes brief descriptions of these petals, and for example, one says, "We honor the interdependent web of all existence with reverence for the great web of life, and with humility we acknowledge our place in it. We covenant to protect Earth and all beings from exploitation. We will create and nurture sustaining relationships of care and respect, mutuality and justice. We will work to repair harm and damaged relationships." For me, and perhaps for you, that well reflects the 7th principle that you would find in our current Article 2. It is true, however, that this and the other 5 descriptions are not identical to the familiar language of the current principles, including the 8th principle. It's true that transformation is alive in this process, just as it is identified as such in that beautiful image of the flower. And admittedly, it is natural, when first considering such a significant change to something important and familiar, to focus on the loss that transformation requires. I felt a kind of grief growing in my heart when the proposal was first being shared. And you may feel that too, and you're entitled to. It's natural. It's human. Indeed, it's a faithful response to valuing something that has mattered for a very long time. And I'd invite you to hold that and an openness to the proposal at the same time, to give yourself time for consideration and reflection. That's what our tradition asks of us in this kind of work. What I do like and what I'm inspired by is how love is understood as a matter of faith and how it's being centered in this proposal. How siding with love is about faith centering love, and about how these 6 values that we identify as central to our lives, well, how in order for them to come to life, a revolutionary, miraculous love will have to be behind them, has to give them power, a kind of love that faces the worst of the worst and calls us out of it and ahead. Maybe siding with and centering love for you means extending forgiveness or reconciliation to someone. Maybe extending the same to yourself. Maybe siding with and centering love is a financial or a stewardship pathway. Maybe siding with and centering love is about learning, about accepting difficult truths and changing, growing in a path toward greater love. And maybe siding with and centering love for you is sacrificial work for the sake of the unloved or the not loved well enough. Whatever it may be, let's unleash both the inner and the outer yellow shirts amongst us. Let's unleash the loved people on ourselves, on our families, on our neighborhoods, and on our world. Remember the message from Valerie Cower this morning. Loving only ourselves is escapism. Loving only our opponents is self-loathing. Loving only others is ineffective. All 3 practices together make love revolutionary. May the love we bring to the world be such, miraculously, revolutionarily, ever and ever. Amen. And friends, we're now going to sing